Rebecca had died a year or two before the new wing was built, and so she never did get to see it. But she left her money to her nieces and nephews, of which I was one. So I got a portion of the mortgage that she was holding on the hotel that I had bought. That reduced my payments to some extent. She also left me her apartment in the house that was built in the old ice house, and that she shared with her brother Ben, who had the downstairs apartment, and she had the upstairs apartment. But she left a life interest in that to my mother. In other words, my mother could use it as long as she lived, but when she was no longer around, I had full use of it. I owned it all that time, and so that was worth quite a bit. Having mentioned the ice house, I think it's interesting. It would be interesting for all of you to know what happened to that ice house and how it progressed in value over the years. In 1940, Ben Silver decided to use that ice house to make an apartment for himself and one for Rebecca. That the ice house was about 40 feet, 20 by 20, and about, that's breadth and width, and about 20 feet high. And it was located within a few feet of the lake because the idea of how it was used was during the winter they would cut the ice on the lake into blocks and lift them up and put them through a large opening near the roof of the ice house and save that ice for the summer months when the guests would need ice for their drinks and their water. It is amazing that they could cut ice in the winter and it still would be around in July and August. The reason for that was it was insulated with horsehair. So it was very well insulated, the walls, then the ice was preserved. Anyway, Ben got this ice house up on rollers and had it pulled up from near the lake to maybe 100 feet west, so that it would be more accessible to the road. And in it, he built in the ice house 3 bedrooms and a bath on 2 floors. Because it was 20 feet high, with a 10-foot ceiling, he could make 2 separate apartments. And then he added a living room of about 12 by 20 to each of the apartments. So it now became a 3-bedroom apartment with a big living room and a deck on the upper level and an outside patio on the lower level. Altogether, quite a remarkable job. He did the work with old material, so I don't think he bought new materials for it, except for the room that he added on both the bottom and the top, and with one laborer. And he figured that it cost about $4,000 to have this house. Rebecca moved into the upstairs one, and Ben Pauline and his two boys used the lower one for the time that they came and occupied the space. We know when my mother died. That's when Sheila and Louis got married, and my mother died just a couple of days after their marriage. And since they were needed a place to live, we all thought that the upstairs apartment of this old ice house, which was now a lovely apartment, would be suitable for them. And I gave it to them to use at a very low rate. If I recall, it was something like $2,000 for the year, and Sheila had been started to work for Citibank, and Louis was doing odd jobs. So the amount for their apartment was really not a problem. The downstairs apartment, which had been used by Ben Silver and his family, became available when Ben and Pauline died, and his children inherited that apartment. Not only did they have better place to stay and more comfortable, but it released the rooms that they had been using in the hotel. Ben and Pauline used to reserve rooms 31 and 33. That was two end rooms on the first floor, but not facing the lake. And Rebecca used a large room with a private bath on the mezzanine, and now these were available to rent from the time they moved out. I was not affected because I had just started working there in 1946 or 7, and it would be a long time before it made any difference to me about the use of those rooms. Anyway, when Rebecca died and left that apartment to my mother and me, Dick and Norman and their wives weren't particularly interested in renting it. They wanted to sell it, and it now was worth somewhere in the neighborhood of $220,000, because although the house was okay, it was nothing special. It was on a lakefront property on Lake Mahopac, and it had 100 feet of lake frontage and a beautiful lawn, and was very desirable. However, I didn't want to sell it because I was happy that Sheila and Louis had a place to stay and they needed it. So I didn't agree to selling it, and they couldn't sell their half. So that's the way it stood. Remained for a number of years with Sheila and Louis renting, living in the upper part, and various renters living in the downstairs area. Sometimes the renter was easy for Sheila and Louis to live with. At other times, they either smoked or made loud noises, had parties, etc. So sometimes it was okay, sometimes it wasn't okay, but there was nothing that they could do about it because they didn't own it, and we didn't own it. It was owned by Dick and Norman. And so that went on for a number of years with Sheila and Louis, sometimes happy with their downstairs neighbors and sometimes annoyed by them. At any rate, this house, which had cost $4,000 to build, was removed from the hotel property when I bought the hotel, because Ben and Pauline and Rebecca wanted to stay there and have it. So when I bought the hotel, I didn't buy that property that was removed from the sale. In the meantime, lakefront property on Lake Mahopac kept getting higher and higher in value. So the house seemed to be growing in value, and probably was worth $250,000 by 1975. Sheila and Louis thought that they would like to buy the house. That way they could control who would get to rent the lower apartment, and they would have some control over what type of people they rented it to. However, they didn't have the money to buy it, and I thought it would be a good idea if they did buy it, and for their own good, and that became part of my goals to buy that house with Sheila and Louis, and we owned half the house. What we had to do was buy out the Dick and Norman from their half ownership.